child born aboard an interstellar vessel might grow for years before fully understanding that the word sky once meant something without a ceiling. For that child, morning could begin when panels above the habitat brighten in measured stages. Air would arrive through ducts. Water would come from a recycling system. Food might grow under lamps in carefully managed gardens. Gravity might be produced, not by a planet beneath the floor, but by the turning of the habitat itself. None of this would feel artificial to someone who had never known anything else. It would simply be home. That is the deeper idea behind a generation ship. It is not merely a spacecraft designed to remain in flight for a very long time. It is a proposal for carrying a functioning human community across distances so large that the original travelers may not live to see the destination. Proxima Centauri, the nearest star beyond the Sun, is about 4.25 light-years away. Even a vessel able to cruise at 1% of light speed would spend more than 4 centuries covering a distance like that before allowing for the time needed to accelerate and slow down. Once a voyage lasts longer than a human lifetime, the problem changes. The engines still matter. So do navigation, shielding, structure, and energy. But the vessel must also provide the ordinary background conditions that Earth gives us without asking for our attention. Human bodies are affected by prolonged weightlessness, including changes to bone, muscle, vision, and the cardiovascular system, which is one reason rotating habitats and other forms of artificial gravity have been studied as possible countermeasures. NASA notes that the exact requirements for artificial gravity in spacecraft are still an open research problem. Beyond Earth's protective environment, radiation becomes another persistent concern. Galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events can increase long-term health risks, and shielding a crew for deep space travel is not a solved problem. Then there is the chemistry of staying alive. A settlement between stars could not depend on regular deliveries of drinking water, oxygen, or fresh food. It would have to recover and reuse materials again and again. ESA's Melisse research explores this kind of regenerative life support, using linked biological and chemical processes to turn waste products and carbon dioxide back into useful resources, such as oxygen, water, and food. The idea is less like packing supplies for a voyage, and more like carrying a small working ecology inside the hull. And even that would only describe the physical world. A ship that lasts for centuries would also need schools, medicine, maintenance, memory, rules, disagreements, celebrations, private lives, and ways of teaching people why certain systems matter. Children would inherit machinery they did not design. Later generations might speak differently from the founders, interpret old traditions differently, and feel no personal memory of Earth at all. At some point, Earth would stop being the place everyone missed. It would become a place in recordings, a blue planet described by teachers, rain experienced through archives, an ocean known from images, a horizon so distant and open that it might seem almost strange to people raised inside a curved habitat. And this is where the journey really begins. Not with the launch of a ship, but with the moment a spacecraft has traveled long enough that the people inside no longer think of themselves as passengers. The machine has become their landscape. The voyage has become their history. And somewhere between two stars, an engineered habitat has become the only world they know. The first thing the ship has to manufacture is something Earth has provided for every human life without machinery: weight. On Earth, gravity is so constant that most of the time it disappears from awareness. A glass stays on a table. Water settles into a basin. A person can stand, walk, sleep, and grow without needing to think about why there is always a downward direction between stars. That familiar direction has to be created. A spacecraft traveling through deep space can coast for long periods without producing the sensation of weight. Inside an ordinary non-rotating cabin, people and objects would float together. For a short mission, the human body can adapt surprisingly well. Over longer periods, however, muscles no longer work against body weight in the same way. Bones receive less mechanical loading. Fluids redistribute through the body. The cardiovascular system changes because it no longer has to move blood through the familiar gradient created by gravity. A voyage lasting centuries could not simply treat these effects as temporary inconveniences. One possible answer is rotation. Imagine a habitat shaped like a broad ring, or perhaps a large cylinder, turning steadily around an axis. A person living along the inner surface would move in a circular path with the structure. The floor continually redirects that person's motion toward the center of the rotation. And from inside the rotating habitat, the result would feel much like being pressed toward the floor. The strength of that apparent gravity depends on two things: how large the habitat is and how quickly it turns. A smaller structure has to rotate more rapidly to produce the same acceleration at its outer living surface. A much larger structure can turn more gradually. That difference matters because rapid rotation introduces sensations that would be unfamiliar to anyone raised on Earth. Move your head while the habitat is spinning, and the motion can interact with the rotation. Throw an object, and its path may appear to curve. Climb toward the central axis, and your apparent weight decreases. Water released into the air does not behave exactly as it would in a kitchen on Earth. These effects come from living inside a rotating reference frame. For the inhabitants, they would not necessarily remain strange forever. A child learning to toss a ball inside such a habitat might develop an instinct for its curved path without ever studying the equations behind it. Someone carrying a cup across a rotating garden would know how the liquid tends to move because that behavior had been familiar since childhood. What would feel unusual to a visitor from Earth might simply become local physics. And this is one of the first ways the ship begins to turn into a world. It develops conditions that belong specifically to itself. The shape of the habitat would influence nearly every part of daily life. Homes could line the outer regions where artificial gravity is strongest. Agricultural areas might occupy broad sections nearby, allowing plants to grow with roots and stems oriented toward a consistent floor and ceiling. Industrial systems could be arranged where machinery benefits from predictable weight. Closer to the axis, the apparent gravity would become weaker. That could make the central region useful for storage, transportation, docking, or activities that benefit from reduced weight. Elevators or transit shafts might connect the inhabited outer surface with this central zone, and traveling inward would mean becoming lighter along the way. A person could begin a trip standing normally in a neighborhood, enter a lift, and feel body weight gradually diminish as the axis approached. The architecture would make mechanics visible. Earth hides much of its machinery beneath familiarity. Gravity does not need a motor room. The horizon does not require bearings. The ground does not need inspection crews to make sure it continues behaving like ground. A rotating habitat would have no such luxury. Its structure would remain under continuous stress. Bearings, joints, pressure walls, seals, electrical systems, fluid lines, and control equipment would all have to survive years that become decades, and decades that become centuries. No engineer could reasonably assume that every original component would remain in place for the full journey, so the ship would have to be designed not merely to last, but to be renewed. Parts would need to be accessible, materials would need to be recoverable, workshops would need to manufacture replacements, critical systems would need alternate paths so that maintenance in one area did not place the entire habitat at risk. A civilization aboard such a vessel might eventually think about machinery the way terrestrial societies think about roads, reservoirs, and power grids, not as one object built at the beginning, but as infrastructure that is continuously inherited. A pipe installed at departure might be gone 200 years later. A compartment surrounding it might have been redesigned several times. A pump could be replaced by another design created aboard the ship. New materials might be developed from whatever feedstock the vessel carries and can recycle. Entire sections of the original engineering could gradually become historical layers beneath later improvements. The ship that arrives would not be physically identical to the ship that left. In that sense, it would resemble a city. Cities persist even though individual buildings vanish. Streets move, utilities are replaced, neighborhoods change purpose. The name remains while the material beneath the name is continuously renewed. A generation ship would need that same ability to survive change without losing function, and every repair would carry an unusual consequence. On Earth, a badly designed building can eventually be abandoned. A failing power station can be replaced by another one somewhere else. A town can draw water from a neighboring region. A machine that becomes too old may simply be discarded. There is no neighboring region between stars. The habitat itself contains the alternatives. That makes redundancy more than an engineering preference. It becomes part of the geography of survival. There may be several routes for moving water, several systems capable of processing air, several independent power channels, several workshops able to produce critical parts. Even knowledge needs redundancy. The person resting tonight beneath an ordinary ceiling rarely needs to know who designed the electrical grid, how the municipal water system works, or which engineer understands the structure beneath the road outside. Civilization distributes those responsibilities across millions of people and countless institutions. Inside one interstellar habitat, the circle is much smaller. Every important system must remain understandable to people who were not alive when it was built. A maintenance procedure written at launch might be studied by a technician whose grandparents' had not yet been born when the first version of that machine was assembled. That technician would not be preserving a museum piece. They would be keeping the floor beneath their community turning. And gradually, the distinction between maintaining a spacecraft and caring for a homeland would disappear. Once the floor has a downward direction, the next problem is far less visible. The ship has to keep the people inside it chemically alive. On Earth, this happens through systems so large that no single person experiences them as machinery. Water evaporates from oceans, condenses into clouds, falls as rain, moves through soil and rivers, enters plants and animals, and eventually returns to the larger cycle. Carbon passes through air, vegetation, oceans, rock, and living tissue. Oxygen is constantly exchanged among organisms, the atmosphere, and the surface. A generation ship cannot carry an ocean. It cannot depend on rainfall. It cannot open a hatch and replace its atmosphere. Every useful material has to be caught, cleaned, transformed, and used again. That includes water. The water inside a long-duration habitat would move through people, plants, food systems, humidity control, sanitation, and industrial processes. Moisture in breath would eventually condense somewhere. Water used for washing would be collected. Urine would be processed. Wastewater from kitchens and agricultural areas would be treated instead of discharged. The goal would not be perfect recycling in the absolute sense. Real systems have losses. Filters degrade. Tiny amounts escape. Some water becomes chemically bound in materials or trapped in waste streams. The goal would be to make those losses small enough that stored reserves and recovery systems could cover them for the entire voyage. That changes the meaning of a glass of water. For the first generation, it may still feel like something taken from Earth. Several centuries later, The same molecules may have passed through thousands of bodies, root systems, pipes, tanks, and filters. The water would no longer belong to any person or any era. It would belong to the ship. Air would circulate in a similar way. Humans consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Plants can reverse part of that exchange through photosynthesis, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen when light and other conditions are right. But a habitat cannot simply fill a room with plants and assume that the atmosphere will regulate itself. The balance has to be measured. Carbon dioxide has to stay within a healthy range. Oxygen cannot drift too far in either direction. Trace gases from plastics, machinery, cleaning products, biological activity, and human metabolism have to be removed before they accumulate. Humidity matters as well. Too much water vapor encourages condensation, corrosion, and microbial growth. Too little can irritate eyes, skin, and respiratory tissue. Temperature, moisture, oxygen, and carbon dioxide all interact with the agricultural system and with human comfort, so the atmosphere would be managed by a combination of biology and machinery. Plants could contribute. So could algae or other microorganisms in specialized bioreactors. Mechanical scrubbers could remove carbon dioxide or unwanted compounds. Chemical systems could provide backup when biological components are unstable. Sensors spread throughout the habitat would watch the air continuously. The result would not be a miniature copy of Earth's atmosphere. It would be a deliberately maintained environment designed to remain within ranges human bodies and crops can tolerate. Food makes the problem more complicated. A ship carrying thousands of people cannot simply load enough meals for centuries. Even if the food never spoiled, the mass would become unreasonable. A settlement in motion has to grow most of what it eats. That means agriculture becomes part of the vessel itself. Rows of crops might grow under controlled light, their roots supported in nutrient solutions or engineered substrates. Different sections could specialize in grains, legumes, vegetables, fruits, or high-yield plants selected for nutrition rather than appearance. The growing areas would have to produce calories, protein, vitamins, oils, and fiber. They would also have to do so reliably. A harvest failure on Earth is serious, but food can often move from another region. A failed harvest between stars has nowhere else to draw from. The agricultural system, therefore, cannot be treated as a single field. It would likely be divided into independent sections with different crops, separate water loops, and enough redundancy that disease or equipment failure in one area would not threaten the entire food supply. Crop diversity would have another purpose. A habitat dependent on one or two highly efficient species might look elegant on paper, but it would also be fragile. A pathogen adapted to one dominant crop could spread rapidly. A nutritional deficiency in the diet might affect the entire population. A genetic weakness in one plant line could become an agricultural problem for generations. Redundancy in food means growing more than the mathematical minimum. It means accepting some inefficiency in exchange for resilience. This is a pattern that appears again and again inside the ship. The most efficient system is not always the safest system. A habitat designed to operate for centuries has to survive the unexpected. That includes the life you did not deliberately bring aboard. No human environment is sterile. Bacteria live on skin, in the mouth, throughout the digestive system, and across nearly every surface people regularly touch. Fungi travel as spores. Microbes grow in water systems, soil-like substrates, filters, drains, and food processing equipment. Many of these organisms are useful. Some are necessary. The human microbiome is part of human biology. Agricultural systems depend on microbial processes. Waste treatment may rely on communities of bacteria to break complex organic material into forms that can be reused. So, the task is not to eliminate microorganisms. It is to manage an ecosystem that cannot be fully seen. This may become one of the more difficult aspects of maintaining a closed habitat over long periods. Microbial populations evolve quickly. Conditions inside pipes or growing systems can favor organisms that were once rare. Biofilms can form on surfaces. A strain that is harmless in one part of the habitat may become troublesome in another. The ship would need routine sampling, monitoring, and biological archives. It might preserve seeds, microbial cultures, tissue samples, and reproductive material in carefully protected storage, so that important biological diversity could be restored if it were lost from the active system. In a sense, the vessel would carry two biospheres. One would be alive and in constant use. The other would wait in reserve. There would be seed banks for plants not currently growing, frozen cell lines, stored genetic material, microbial cultures held as references. Perhaps entire collections of organisms that are unnecessary for the voyage itself, but considered valuable for the future settlement. Every one of these collections would represent a choice about what pieces of Earth were important enough to bring. There would be practical limits. A generation ship could not carry every species. It could not rebuild a rainforest or a coral reef inside the hull just because those ecosystems matter on Earth. Space, energy, mass, and maintenance would force the designers to choose. Some species would come because humans need them. Some because agriculture depends on them. Some because they might be valuable at the destination. Others might be preserved only as genetic information or frozen biological samples rather than living populations. Those choices would create a strange kind of artificial ecology. A field of wheat might exist beneath lamps without any true weather. Fruit trees might grow in carefully managed soil beds, while the stars outside remain almost unchanged. Pollination might be handled by insects in one section, by mechanical assistants in another. There might be no mosquitoes, no large predators, no migrating herds, no seasons unless the inhabitants create them. And yet to someone born there, the agricultural ring could become the closest thing to wilderness they have ever known. A child might know the smell of wet-growing substrate long before understanding what rain smells like. They might recognize the sound of irrigation pumps, the way another child recognizes water running through a creek. A grove of small trees under an artificial afternoon could become a place associated with privacy, conversation, or childhood games. The distinction between life support equipment and landscape would begin to blur. That blending is important. Plants would not exist only to make oxygen and calories. They would also provide texture, color, smell, and variation inside an environment dominated by engineered surfaces. Humans evolved in settings filled with living complexity. Leaves move, water reflects light, growing things change from day to day. A habitat that contains these elements may support people in ways that do not appear on a simple engineering diagram. But every garden would still be part of a budget. Light requires energy. Pumps require energy. Temperature control requires energy. Nutrient recovery, biomass, requires equipment. Every kilogram of biomass affects the ship's mass. Every square meter devoted to plants is space that cannot be used for something else. The designers would have to decide how much biological richness the community can afford. That decision would not remain fixed forever. Later generations might change the mix of crops. They might decide that a certain plant is not productive enough to justify the resources it uses, or they might preserve it because it has become culturally important. Tree planted by the founding crew could survive long enough to become a historical object. Its descendants might occupy a small garden where people gather for ceremonies or simply sit beneath leaves that trace their ancestry back to Earth. That would be a different kind of archive, not data stored in a computer, life maintaining continuity through reproduction, and the system supporting all of it would have to close the loop. Human waste would be processed. Plant material that could not be eaten would be broken down. Nutrients would be recovered and returned to growing systems. Carbon would move from people into air, from air into plants, from plants into food, and from food back into people. Nothing in that cycle would be perfectly clean. There would be contaminants to remove, salts to manage, trace elements to replace, and materials that accumulate in places engineers did not expect. A closed ecosystem does not become simple because it is enclosed. It becomes more sensitive to imbalance. Earth can absorb local mistakes across enormous reservoirs. A ship cannot. If too much nitrogen ends up locked in a waste stream, crop production notices. If trace minerals disappear from the agricultural cycle, plant health notices. If a population grows faster than food production, the numbers eventually meet. The entire society would live inside those balances, whether people thought about them or not. Perhaps most of the time they would not. That would be one sign that the system was working. Someone could wake, drink water, eat breakfast, walk beneath trees, and begin a normal day without thinking about where yesterday's wastewater had gone, or which organisms had helped recycle the nutrients in the meal. The machinery would disappear into routine. The cycles would become background, and when that happens, something built as life support begins to resemble something deeper. It begins to resemble nature. A living world inside a ship also needs something that every forest, city, ocean current, and human body on Earth ultimately depends on: a steady flow of energy. On Earth, most of that energy arrives from the sun. It warms the surface, drives weather, powers photosynthesis, moves water through the atmosphere, and supports nearly every food chain. Human civilization adds its own layers of power generation, but the planet itself still sits inside a continuous stream of sunlight. An interstellar habitat would gradually leave that stream behind. As the ship moved farther from the sun, daylight outside would weaken. Solar panels that worked well near Earth would become less useful with distance. Eventually, the sun would appear as one bright star among many, no longer an energy source capable of supporting a city. The ship would have to carry its own star, in a sense. Not a literal one, but an energy system powerful enough to support everything that makes the habitat livable. Lighting for agriculture, pumps moving water, fans circulating air, computers watching thousands of sensors, medical equipment, workshops, heating and cooling, recycling plants, communication systems, the machinery that maintains rotation, and the ordinary electrical needs of thousands of people who still expect homes, schools, kitchens, tools, and places to gather. All of those demands continue every hour of every day. The power system, therefore, cannot be treated like a single engine that runs until it wears out. It has to become an ecosystem of its own. One possible starting point is nuclear fission. Fission reactors already operate by releasing energy from the nuclei of heavy atoms. On Earth, they can produce large amounts of steady power from relatively small quantities of fuel. A generation ship could carry multiple reactors, separated from one another so that trouble in one would not disable the rest. But centuries create complications. Fuel has to last. Reactor components are exposed to heat, radiation, mechanical stress, and gradual material damage. Control systems must remain reliable. Parts that are difficult to replace on Earth would have to be replaceable in deep space. That means a ship could not simply carry reactors. It would need the industrial knowledge to keep nuclear power alive. Future generations might have to manufacture components that the original designers assumed would never fail. They might have to inspect metals for microscopic damage, rebuild pumps, replace shielding, process fuel, and understand the underlying physics well enough to respond. When the problem does not match any procedure in the archive, fusion would offer another possibility if it becomes practical at the scale such a vessel requires. Fusion joins light atomic nuclei and can release enormous amounts of energy from comparatively little fuel. In principle, some fusion fuels are easier to store in large quantities than the heavy elements used in fission. But a working fusion power plant for a generation ship would need more than a successful reaction. It would need durability, maintenance, fuel handling, radiation management, heat rejection, and the ability to operate without outside support for spans of time far longer than any power plant has ever been asked to survive. The important point is not which reactor design wins. It is that energy becomes part of the ship's long memory. Every generation must know how power is made, where its limits are, and what parts of life depend on it, because almost everything does. The agricultural system may look biological, but its lights are electrical. The water cycle may resemble nature, but pumps and filters keep it moving. The atmosphere may contain plants, but sensors and control systems watch the chemistry. The apparent sunrise above a neighborhood exists because power is available to create it. Even night would be engineered. A habitat might dim its lighting gradually over a 24-hour cycle, changing brightness and color to support human circadian rhythms. Morning could begin with warmer tones. Midday might become brighter and cooler. Evening could shift back toward amber before the habitat entered its artificial night. People born aboard would probably experience this cycle as naturally as people on Earth experience dawn and sunset. Yet somewhere behind the ceiling, power systems would be creating every sunrise they had ever seen. That dependence introduces a question that reaches into nearly every design decision. What happens when the power falls? A brief interruption in one apartment is an inconvenience. A prolonged loss across the habitat is something else entirely. Ventilation slows. Water treatment may stop. Agricultural lighting disappears. Temperatures begin moving away from their controlled ranges. Medical systems lose capacity. Communication between sections becomes harder. If rotation depends on powered systems for active control, even the geometry of daily life can eventually be affected. So the ship needs layers of stored energy and alternate generation. Batteries might carry essential systems through short interruptions. Separate reactors could isolate failures. Some sections might maintain independent microgrids capable of operating even if the main network is damaged. Critical life support equipment could receive power through multiple routes. Hospitals, water systems, atmospheric control and command functions might each have local reserves. The ship's electrical network would resemble a web rather than a single trunk. That web would be designed with one assumption in mind: something will fail. Not in some distant hypothetical future. Over several centuries, failure becomes normal. What matters is whether the failure remains small. This changes the culture around maintenance. A person who discovers an unusual vibration in a coolant pump may be noticing nothing serious, or they may be the first person to see a problem that, unattended, would affect a reactor months later. In a civilization that cannot call a repair company, that observation matters. Maintenance becomes a form of stewardship, not glamorous work, not heroic work, just the persistent act of noticing what has begun to change. The same is true of the ship's outer layers. Outside the habitat, the environment is almost empty, but not harmless. Interstellar space contains charged particles, energetic radiation, microscopic grains of matter, and the occasional larger particle moving relative to the ship at tremendous speed. The faster the vessel travels, the more important those small particles become. A grain of dust that would seem insignificant while floating near Earth can strike with serious energy when the ship is moving at a meaningful fraction of light speed. The front of the vessel would therefore need protection. Exactly how that protection works would depend on the ship's speed and design. Engineers might use thick sacrificial layers, replaceable shielding, separated outer structures, magnetic or plasma concepts for some charged particles, or combinations of methods. No single layer would do everything. Radiation creates a different problem. Earth protects life partly through its atmosphere and magnetic environment. A generation ship has no planetary atmosphere surrounding it, and no natural magnetosphere extending thousands of miles into space. The habitat would need to create protection with matter. Water is useful for shielding against some forms of radiation, and a ship already needs large quantities of it. Designers could place water storage around inhabited sections rather than keeping all of it in isolated tanks. Food reserves, structural materials, and other supplies could also contribute to shielding if arranged carefully. This leads to an interesting feature of the ship's architecture. The walls around a home might not simply be walls. Beyond them could be layers of water tanks, storage compartments, machinery, and structural material deliberately positioned between people and space. The landscape of the vessel would be shaped by invisible particles arriving from the galaxy. Some areas might be more heavily protected than others. During periods of elevated radiation risk, people could move into deeper shelters surrounded by additional mass. Hospitals, nurseries, and frequently occupied spaces might be placed where shielding is strongest. Children could grow up knowing which corridors lead inward to the safest sections, not from fear, from routine, the way people on Earth learn where to go. During severe weather, the inhabitants could learn the geometry of their own protection. Radiation would also influence what happens to electronics. High-energy particles can disrupt computer systems and damage components over time. A generation ship cannot assume that a processor installed on launch day will still function centuries later, so computing hardware would need replacement cycles. Critical software would have to migrate to new machines. Data would need multiple copies. The ship might preserve design specifications for its own electronics so that later generations could manufacture compatible replacements or redesign systems while retaining the functions the vessel depends on. This raises another quiet but important possibility. Technology aboard the ship would evolve. The founders might imagine the vessel as a finished object. Their descendants would probably prove them wrong. A reactor control system developed 200 years into the voyage could be better than the original. New materials could replace older ones. Agricultural lighting might become more efficient. Medical equipment could improve. Software could be rewritten. Manufacturing methods could change as people learn more about the particular environment in which they live. The vessel would begin producing its own technological history. There would be original systems, second-generation systems, repairs that became permanent, local inventions, design traditions taught from one engineer to another, perhaps even disagreements about whether an old system should be preserved because it had worked for centuries, or replaced because something newer promised better performance. The ship would not remain a time capsule. It would become a place where technology continued to develop under unusual constraints. Every innovation would have to respect a simple fact: resources are finite. If a new machine requires a material the ship cannot obtain or recycle, then the design is useless, no matter how clever it is. A generation ship would therefore value a different kind of engineering from many societies on Earth. Repairability would matter more. Material recovery would matter more. Interchangeable components would matter more. A device that lasts a little longer but cannot be repaired, that might be less valuable than one that can be rebuilt indefinitely. Waste would look different as well. A broken motor is not just trash, it is copper, steel, magnets, ceramics, fasteners, and perhaps components that can be recovered. An old pressure vessel is not debris, it is feedstock. A failed electronic board contains elements that future manufacturing may need. The ship would carry no landfill in the ordinary sense because there is nowhere for discarded material to disappear. Matter would circle through industry the way water circles through life support. A component would be made, used, worn down, taken apart, sorted, melted or processed, then returned in some new form. Over enough centuries, the same piece of metal could become many different objects, part of a pump, then part of a structural bracket, then feedstock for a medical instrument, then something else again. The people using those objects might never know their history, but the material would remain inside the world. Nothing would truly be thrown away. And this may be one of the deepest differences between a ship and a planet. Earth is so large that human beings have often been able to imagine there is an elsewhere, somewhere waste can go, somewhere resources can come from, somewhere beyond the horizon. Inside an interstellar habitat, there is no elsewhere. The boundary is visible in every system. Energy must be generated, matter must be recovered, damage must be noticed, shielding must be maintained. Every ordinary day depends on generations of people continuing to care for machines whose successful operation is easiest to ignore. And perhaps that is how the ship begins to feel most like a world. Not because it perfectly imitates Earth, but because the people inside gradually stop seeing its systems as inventions. The reactor becomes part of the background. The water tanks become part of the walls. The turning structure becomes gravity. The lamps become morning. And the long work of keeping all of it alive becomes simply what people do. There is one resource the ship cannot recover by melting down a broken machine. A human population has to renew itself. That sounds simple at first. People are born, people grow older, and the community continues. But aboard a vessel with fixed living space, fixed agricultural capacity, fixed medical resources, and no new settlers arriving from outside, population becomes part of the life support system. Too few births over many decades, and the number of people begins to fall. Too many, and food, housing, water, medical care, and energy come under increasing pressure. The balance does not have to be perfect every year, but over generations the trend matters. A generation ship would therefore need to understand its population in the same careful way it understands oxygen or water. Not because human beings are interchangeable units, they are not. Because every person also carries something the ship needs. Skills, relationships, genetic variation, memory, and the possibility of another generation. Age structure matters too. A ship with the right, total, and vulnerable if too many people are old at the same time, or if a long period of low births leaves too few younger adults to take over demanding work. Demography would therefore be watched across decades, not just as a headcount, but as a moving pattern of children, working adults, caregivers, teachers, technicians, and elders. The community would be planning not only for how many people exist now, but for who will be available 20 or 40 years later. The genetic part is easy to misunderstand. A population can appear comfortably large and still lose variation over time if only a limited portion of that population contributes children to later generations. Population geneticists use the idea of effective population size to describe this distinction. The number of people physically alive is not always the same as the number that matters for how genes are carried forward. Chance also plays a role. In every generation, some genetic variants are passed on more often than others, simply because of who happens to have children. Others become less common. In a very large population, these random shifts are usually diluted by scale. In a smaller and isolated population, they can matter more. This is genetic drift. Over enough time, drift can reduce diversity even when nobody has made any deliberate choice to do so. A second issue is relatedness. If a population remains closed for many generations, more people eventually share recent ancestors. That does not mean a healthy community suddenly becomes unhealthy. The process is gradual, and its importance depends on population size, family structure, reproductive patterns, and the genetic diversity present at the beginning. For a real mission, there would probably be no single magic number of founders. Different models would produce different answers because they make different assumptions about voyage length, mortality, fertility, family size, reproductive participation, and the biological material carried in storage. That uncertainty is important. It means the population problem would not be solved only by putting a certain number of names on a passenger list. The ship would need a plan for maintaining diversity over time. One tool might be cryopreserved reproductive material. Human sperm, eggs, embryos, and other cells can already be stored at very low temperatures for medical and research purposes. A future vessel could carry a much larger biological archive, protected in several independent locations. The archive could hold genetic material from people who never traveled aboard the ship at all. In that sense, part of Earth's population could make the journey without occupying cabins, eating food, or breathing air. Whether stored material could remain reliable across centuries is another matter. No human institution has yet demonstrated reproductive cryostorage over the span a generation ship might require. A vessel would need redundant freezers, careful monitoring, maintenance, and probably more than one storage method if future biotechnology allows it. But the principle is powerful. A community could preserve variation outside the living population and reintroduce some of it later when medically and ethically appropriate. That possibility changes the idea of ancestry. Imagine a child born 200 years into the voyage whose genetic connection reaches not only to parents and grandparents aboard the ship, but also to a donor who lived on Earth before departure. The child would never know that person. The donor would never know the child. And yet a biological thread could pass between them across centuries. For the people aboard, this might become one of the more tangible ways Earth remains present. Not as a landscape, as inheritance. Medicine would carry another part of that inheritance. A generation ship could begin with a carefully selected population, but selection at departure cannot guarantee health forever. People will still develop cancer, infections, injuries, autoimmune disorders, complications of pregnancy, dental problems, changes in vision, and all the ordinary conditions that accompany human life. Some illnesses could be treated with medicines manufactured aboard. Others would require surgery. Some might need therapies that were not even imagined when the vessel launched. That means the medical system has to be more than a stocked clinic. It has to be capable of learning. Pharmaceutical production would likely need to move on board for at least some drugs, because many medications do not remain stable for centuries. Diagnostic systems would need repair and replacement. Medical training would have to continue without access to outside hospitals. A doctor aboard the ship could not always send a patient to a specialist in another city. The specialist would need to exist somewhere inside the same world, or the knowledge would need to be available to someone capable of using it. This creates a familiar pattern. Redundancy returns. If only one person understands a difficult surgical procedure, the ship does not truly possess that skill. If several people are trained, if simulations remain available, if anatomy and technique are taught continuously, then the knowledge has a better chance of surviving the loss of any one individual. The same principle would apply to obstetrics, pediatrics, genetics, infectious disease, dentistry, mental health, and emergency medicine. A generation ship would not simply carry doctors, it would have to keep producing them. And because the population cannot grow without limit, reproduction would become one of the places where biology, ethics, and resource management meet most directly. A ship has a carrying capacity. That capacity may change as agricultural systems improve or degrade, as habitat sections open or close, and as energy production changes. But at any given time, there will be a practical range of population the vessel can support. Human reproductive freedom has never been a simple engineering variable, and turning it into one would create serious ethical problems. So any workable system would have to balance individual choice with collective limits in a way the community itself considered legitimate. There is no known solution that removes the tension. The important point is that the tension would belong to the society, not merely to the designers who launched it. Rules written on Earth might be reconsidered generations later. A policy that seemed fair to the founders could feel intolerable to their descendants. A population crisis might force temporary restrictions that no one had expected. New reproductive technologies might create options the original planners never imagined. The community would have to make decisions for itself. And those decisions would shape more than numbers. They would shape families, childhood, kinship, the meaning of parenthood, perhaps even the way people think about the future. On Earth, having a child is usually understood in the scale of a family and a lifetime. On a generation ship, it would also be tied to a voyage. Every birth would add someone who had not chosen the mission but would inherit it. That fact cannot be engineered away. A child born in the middle years of the crossing would open their eyes inside a world selected by people they would never meet. Their air, their gravity, their language, their available food, their horizon, and perhaps even the approximate size of their community, would all be consequences of choices made before their birth. In this respect, the ship makes visible something that is already true on Earth. No one chooses the conditions into which they are born. Every generation inherits structures, landscapes, technologies, debts, opportunities, and decisions from people who came before. The difference aboard the ship is that the boundary of inheritance is much easier to see. There is a hull around it. The children would not be passengers waiting to become colonists. They would be inhabitants from the beginning. They might love the place. They might resent parts of it. They would certainly change it. And over time, the founders' ideas about family and responsibility would mix with the lived experience of people for whom Earth was never home. A grandmother might tell a child about a grandmother of her own who once remembered real rain. A medical student might learn from a training archive recorded before departure. A baby might be born using genetic material preserved since the first years of the voyage. 3 different forms of inheritance could meet in one room: story, knowledge, biology. This is how a population survives across centuries. Not by remaining unchanged, by remaining connected enough that change does not erase continuity. The ship needs people who can replace the people who are gone, but it also needs a way for those new people to become fully themselves rather than copies of the founders. A civilization can preserve a genome and still lose a culture. It can preserve a culture and still lose the scientific knowledge needed to maintain its habitat. It can preserve both and still fail if its children inherit a world they do not believe belongs to them. So the population is not cargo. It is not one more subsystem enclosed by the hull. It is the part of the ship that can remember, question, learn, disagree, repair, teach, and begin again. And with every generation born between the stars, the voyage becomes a little less like something humanity launched and a little more like a world continuing on its own. A population can remain healthy, well-fed, and technically capable and still fail for reasons no machine can detect. people have to keep living together. For the first generation, the purpose of the ship would be unusually clear. They would remember Earth. They would remember the construction effort, the training, the departure, perhaps even the final view of the planet shrinking behind them. Whatever disagreements existed aboard, everyone would share one piece of history. They had chosen to leave. Their children would inherit something different. They could understand why the voyage began, without remembering the decision itself. Earth would be a place their parents described, visible in recordings and photographs, but never experienced directly. The mission would already be shifting from a personal commitment into an inherited one. Several generations later, even that connection would weaken. The founders would become names, then portraits, then historical figures. The launch might eventually feel as distant to the people aboard as events several centuries ago feel to us now. And yet the machinery would still require cooperation every day. Someone would have to manage water allocation. Someone would decide how much power a new workshop could use. Someone would determine which habitat section received priority during maintenance. Someone would settle disputes between families, institutions, professions, and neighborhoods. The ship therefore needs government, not simply a captain, a political system. The command structure appropriate during departure might not remain appropriate for a community whose inhabitants expect to spend their entire lives aboard. A spacecraft crew can accept hierarchy because a mission is temporary and the roles are tightly defined. A society is different. People marry, raise children, own personal belongings, form friendships, create organizations, argue about fairness, and develop interests that do not fit neatly into a chain of command. Over time, authority would have to justify itself. One possibility would be representative government with elected councils responsible for broad social decisions, while technically qualified institutions manage systems that cannot safely be governed by popularity alone. That division sounds straightforward until a real disagreement appears. Suppose engineers determine that an aging agricultural section must be shut down for several months. The shutdown would reduce food variety and perhaps living space nearby. Residents object. A council proposes delaying the work. The engineers insist that delay increases the chance of a much larger failure. At that moment, the distinction between a technical question and a political question becomes difficult to maintain. Who decides how much risk is acceptable? The engineer understands the machinery. The residents live with the consequences. The council represents the community. All three have legitimate concerns. A durable society would need institutions capable of handling disagreements like this without treating every dispute as a threat to the mission. That may be more important than designing a perfect constitution at departure. No political system remains unchanged for centuries. Words acquire new meanings. Institutions accumulate traditions. Rules created for one problem are later used for another. Some offices gain influence, others lose it. A system designed by people on Earth would almost certainly be revised by people who had never lived there. That would not necessarily represent failure. It might be evidence that the society was alive. The greater danger would be creating a structure so rigid that ordinary change becomes impossible. A community sealed inside a hull cannot easily tolerate prolonged civil conflict, but suppressing disagreement creates its own instability. Resentment does not disappear because expressing it is forbidden. It tends to move elsewhere, into private networks, families, workplaces, and generations raised with memories of decisions they consider unjust. So the ship would need room for argument, room for unpopular opinions, room for people to question rules created before they were born. And at the same time, there would be boundaries that could not be treated casually. No one could decide that atmospheric maintenance was optional. No group could claim unlimited water. Critical equipment could not become the private property of whoever controlled the room containing it. Some freedoms that feel ordinary on Earth would encounter physical limits aboard the ship, because every person's behavior occurs inside the same finite system. The difficult work would be deciding where necessity ends and unnecessary control begins. That boundary would probably move. A community facing abundant harvests and reliable power might permit choices that become impossible. After a major system failure, a temporary emergency authority might be useful during a crisis and dangerous if leadership refuses to surrender it afterward. History on Earth contains many versions of that problem. The people aboard would know those histories. Whether they would avoid repeating them is another question. Education would matter enormously here. Children would need mathematics, biology, engineering, medicine, language, and history. But they would also need to understand how their society works and why certain rules exist. A rule remembered only as a command becomes fragile. A rule whose purpose is understood can be questioned intelligently. Perhaps every student would eventually learn the basic architecture of the habitat. Not enough to become an engineer, but enough to understand that water comes from a loop. Air is actively managed. Food production has limits, and energy has a measurable cost. Civic education and systems education might become difficult to separate. To understand citizenship would partly mean understanding the physical world that citizenship depends upon. The ship would also have professions, and professions create identities. People working in agriculture might develop their own language and traditions. Reactor technicians might form another community. Medical workers, educators, structural engineers, artists, machinists, software specialists, and habitat planners would spend years around colleagues who understand the same work. This is normal. It also creates the possibility of social divisions. A profession associated with critical systems could gradually acquire higher status. Families with long histories in certain technical fields might gain influence. Neighborhoods with better access to gardens or larger living quarters might become desirable. Small inequalities could harden if advantages are repeatedly passed to children. Inside a closed population, those divisions would be difficult to escape by simply moving somewhere else. There is nowhere else. A healthy society would therefore need ways for people to move between roles and communities. A child born to two agricultural workers should be able to become a physician. The son of a council member should not automatically become one. Training should remain accessible. Authority should remain accountable. Work that receives less prestige should still provide dignity and a meaningful place in the community. These might sound like social ideals rather than mission requirements. On a generation ship, they could become both. People who believe the society does not belong to them have less reason to protect its institutions, and everyone aboard depends on those institutions. Culture may become the deeper stabilizing force. Laws can require certain behavior. Culture helps explain why people continue behaving responsibly when nobody is watching. The first crew would bring songs, stories, languages, holidays, games, faiths, philosophies, and family customs from Earth. Some would survive, others would fade. New ones would appear. Perhaps Departure Day becomes an annual observance for the first few generations and later transforms into something the founders would barely recognize. Maybe children invent games based on the changing apparent gravity near the axis. Perhaps a particular meal is served during major maintenance periods because an early crew once prepared it during a difficult repair. A phrase spoken by the first engineers might become a proverb after its original context has been forgotten. This is how cultures grow. Not by following a plan exactly, By accumulating meaning, language would change with it. New words would be needed for experiences that had no ordinary equivalent on Earth. The inward direction toward the axis might acquire slang. Different habitat sections could develop accents. Technical terms might enter everyday speech. Expressions built around weather could slowly lose their intuitive meaning among people who had never stood in rain. Formal education could preserve the language of old, technical archives, while casual conversation continues evolving around it. The society might effectively maintain several layers of language at once. One for daily life, one for technical precision, one for historical material from Earth. That would make the archive usable even as spoken culture changes. But preserving information is not the same as preserving memory. A person can watch thousands of hours of recordings of an ocean without knowing what cold seawater feels like around the ankles. They can study thunderstorms without ever feeling pressure change before rain. Earth would eventually become something the inhabitants knew in remarkable detail, but could not remember. That distance might produce grief in some people. For others, perhaps not. Someone born 300 years into the crossing might feel no personal loss when looking at images of Earth. They may find the planet beautiful. They may value its history. They might even feel gratitude toward the people who built the ship. But home would be elsewhere. Home might be a curved corridor where the evening lamps dim at the same hour each day. A garden where familiar trees grow beneath a ceiling. A public room where neighbors gather after work. The low vibration of equipment that has been audible since childhood. The particular way a ball bends through the air in the rotating habitat. The face of someone waiting at the end of a hallway. That change in loyalty may be necessary. A society cannot remain healthy for centuries if every generation is taught that the place where they live is merely an inferior copy of somewhere better. The vessel has to become worthy of attachment. People have to be allowed to make it theirs. They will decorate it, rename places, change ceremonies, rewrite laws, fall in love there, grieve there, complain about it, protect it, and children will eventually hear stories about Earth while sitting in a world their ancestors would have called a machine. By then, the mission will no longer survive because everyone remembers why the founders left. It will survive because the people aboard have found their own reasons to continue. The most dangerous failure aboard the ship may begin without an alarm. A technician notices that a pump is taking a little longer to reach its normal pressure. Nothing stops working. The water still moves. The readings remain inside their acceptable range, so the observation is recorded. A week later, the vibration has changed slightly. Months pass. Someone replaces a worn bearing, and the problem appears to disappear. Then a second system begins behaving strangely. Individually, neither problem seems serious. Together, they may be the first signs of something the original designers never anticipated. This is the kind of difficulty that becomes more important as a machine grows old. A generation ship would not merely have to survive dramatic accidents. It would have to survive the slow accumulation of small changes, metal fatigue, corrosion, radiation damage, software errors, microbial growth inside pipes, sensors that begin to drift away from accurate readings, valves that still work, but not quite as efficiently as they once did, a filter that removes 98% of a contaminant instead of 99%. On Earth, these small degradations are often absorbed by large systems and outside support. A replacement component can be ordered. An unfamiliar failure can be studied by another laboratory. A manufacturer can send someone who worked on the original design. Between stars, those people are gone. After 200 years, even their children may be gone. The people responsible for the machine are descendants of descendants, working with systems that have been repaired, modified, and rebuilt many times. So, the ship needs something beyond durable hardware. It needs durable understanding. There is an important difference between knowing what to do and knowing why it works. A procedure might say to open one valve, reduce power to a pump, wait 12 seconds, and then increase flow through a second line. Someone can memorize those steps, but if the system behaves in a way the procedure never anticipated, memorization is no longer enough. The person standing in front of the control panel has to understand pressure, flow, chemistry, materials, and the particular history of that machine. They need to reason from principles. That is why a school aboard the ship may be as important as any reactor. Every generation would have to recreate the expertise required to keep the habitat alive. Children would learn ordinary subjects, but some of their education would carry an unusual weight. Physics would explain the world beneath their feet. Chemistry would explain the water they drink. Biology would explain the gardens and microbial systems surrounding them. Mathematics would appear in population models, structural loads, orbital navigations, budgets. Engineering would not be an abstract profession performed somewhere else. It would be the study of home. Some students would become specialists. Most would not. But perhaps nearly everyone would leave school with a basic understanding of how the habitat breathes, drinks, turns, and repairs itself. The deeper training would continue for years. A future reactor engineer might begin by learning from teachers who learned from other teachers. In a chain extending all the way back to Earth, that chain cannot be allowed to become a sequence of rituals whose meaning has been forgotten. If one generation teaches only procedures, the next generation inherits less understanding than the one before. Repeat that pattern long enough, and the ship becomes dependent on instructions. Nobody fully understands. A machine can survive that condition for a while. Eventually, something happens that is not in the manual. The educational system, therefore, has to resist knowledge erosion. Original design documents would be preserved, so would later revisions. Repairs would need careful records, explaining not only what changed, but why. Failed solutions would be worth saving too. Knowing that an earlier team tried a certain modification and discovered an unexpected problem may prevent a later team from repeating the same mistake. The technical archive would gradually become a history of the ship, written in pressures, materials, diagrams, experiments, and repairs. But an archive can become difficult to use. Languages change, terminology changes, file formats become obsolete, software disappears. A document stored safely for 3 centuries is of little value if no functioning system can read it. So information would have to migrate. Old records would be copied into new formats. Technical language might be deliberately preserved even while everyday speech evolves. Important diagrams could exist digitally and physically. Some knowledge might be printed onto materials designed for long storage. The most critical principles could be taught repeatedly instead of trusted entirely to storage. Knowledge survives best when it lives in more than one place. In a database, in a book, in a classroom, in the hands of someone who knows how a machine sounds when it is healthy. That last form is difficult to preserve. Experienced people notice things that are hard to reduce to instructions. A physician sees that a patient does not look quite right before a test shows why. A gardener notices a change in leaf texture before the sensors detect a nutrient imbalance. A machinist hears an unfamiliar tone inside rotating equipment. This kind of practical knowledge develops through years of attention. When an experienced person dies, part of that knowledge can disappear with them. The ship would need apprenticeship as much as formal education. Young engineers working beside older ones. Medical trains following physicians through ordinary cases before they ever face an emergency. Agricultural specialists learning the smell and appearance of healthy, growing systems. not just reading numerical displays. Across generations, these relationships would become another form of redundancy. One person teaches another. That person teaches someone younger. No transmission is perfect, but the chain remains alive. There is something familiar in this, even under unfamiliar circumstances. Human beings have always passed difficult skills forward this way. A navigator once learned the night sky from someone older. A craftsperson learned how material behaved from another pair of hands. A physician learned not only from books, but from patients and teachers. The tools change. The act of inheritance does not. On the ship, however, the consequences of losing a skill can become immediate. Imagine an infectious disease moving through one section of the habitat. The illness itself might be manageable. But suppose several members of the same maintenance team become sick at once because they work together every day. Suddenly, a biological problem becomes an engineering problem. If the only people experienced with a particular reactor subsystem are unavailable, the ship has temporarily lost more than workers. It has lost capability. This is why critical knowledge would need to be spread widely. A specialist can have depth. The community still needs backups. Emergency cross-training could allow people from neighboring disciplines to keep a system stable until the primary experts return. Medical planning would face the same concern. An outbreak inside a closed habitat is unlike an outbreak in a city connected to a larger world. There is no outside hospital, no additional staff arriving tomorrow, no new pharmaceutical shipment. The medical system has whatever the ship can manufacture, store, or improvise. That argues for quarantine capability built into the architecture. Sections of the habitat might be able to reduce physical contact while preserving independent air handling and access to necessary services. Medical supplies could be distributed rather than concentrated in one room. The community would practice responses before they were needed, not because crisis should dominate daily life, because rehearsed actions require less confusion when people are tired or frightened. The same principle applies to mechanical emergencies. A healthy ship culture would treat early warnings as valuable information rather than inconvenient news. Someone who reports an unusual pressure trend should not fear being blamed for creating a problem. Someone who questions a reassuring interpretation should be heard. The vessel cannot afford an institutional habit of ignoring uncomfortable data. Machines do not care whether their measurements are politically convenient. Water recovery either declines or it does not. A structural crack either grows or it does not. The community has to remain willing to see what is happening before the situation becomes dramatic. That may be one of the hardest traditions to preserve. Not a ceremony, a habit of attention. Centuries into the voyage, the ship's greatest protection may not be a particular piece of equipment. It may be a society that has learned to notice small changes, preserve deep knowledge, train replacements before they are needed, and speak clearly when something no longer behaves as expected, because most worlds do not fail in a single moment. They change gradually, and a civilization living inside machinery has to become good at noticing the difference between ordinary change and the beginning of something that matters. The ship can cross a great distance without ever making that distance feel real. There is no ocean passing beneath it, no sequence of landscapes, no roadside markers counting down the remaining miles. For most of the voyage, the stars outside would change so slowly that daily life could continue for years without the sky offering any obvious sense of motion. Progress would exist mainly as a number: distance traveled, distance remaining, velocity, time until the next navigation correction. For the generations living in the middle of the journey, those numbers could become almost abstract. The destination might still be more than a century away. Earth might already be several light years behind, and the people alive at that moment would occupy a strange position between two worlds they had never touched. One existed in the past, the other existed in the future. Their whole lives would happen between them. Communication with Earth could continue for a long time, but distance would reshape what communication means. A radio or laser signal still travels at the speed of light. That is very fast across a planet. Across interstellar space, it is simply the fastest possible delay. When the ship is 1 light year from Earth, a message takes 1 year to arrive. A reply cannot return for another year. At 2 light years, a simple question and answer can span 4 years. Eventually, conversation becomes correspondence with history. A child might record a message for relatives on Earth and receive an answer only after moving into another stage of life. A scientist aboard the ship could send a technical question home and know that by the time the response returns, the problem may already have been solved locally or become irrelevant. The people answering on Earth would also change. Governments could change. Institutions could disappear. Languages could shift. The organization that launched the ship might no longer exist in its original form. The planet would still be there, but the relationship would become less like speaking to home and more like exchanging archives between civilizations. News would arrive old. A discovery announced from Earth would already have happened years earlier. A birth announcement could be followed in the same incoming transmission schedule by news from a much later stage of the same person's life. Events would reach the ship in layers, determined by distance. For the people aboard, Earth would begin to occupy a different kind of time. That change might be emotionally difficult for some generations and barely noticeable to others. The founders could miss particular people. Their children might miss a planet described by people they loved. Later descendants could feel affection toward Earth without experiencing absence in the same way. They would not be waiting to go back. Their lives would already be complete where they were. This matters because a generation ship cannot survive as a permanent waiting room. A civilization needs a present tense. People need reasons to care about this year's harvest, this year's students, this year's repairs, marriages, disputes, festivals, research, music, and ordinary afternoons. If every life is treated merely as preparation for a destination far beyond one's own lifetime, the journey risks becoming psychologically empty. So meaning would have to exist inside the passage itself. A teacher might spend decades improving a curriculum that will eventually be taught by students not yet born. An engineer could redesign part of the water system, knowing that the most important benefit may come long after retirement. Parents might raise children who will never see the destination, while knowing that those children will help preserve the conditions that allow someone else to arrive. These are long chains of consequence. They ask people to care about outcomes they cannot personally witness. Human beings already do this on smaller scales. We plant trees whose mature shade may belong to someone else. We preserve buildings. We maintain languages. We create institutions intended to survive their founders. We leave records for people we will never meet. Inside a generation ship, that familiar human tendency would become one of the central forces, holding the voyage together. Then, after centuries of this long middle, something changes. The destination begins to become less abstract. At first, the change appears in instruments. The target star grows brighter. Its position becomes easier to measure. Any known planets around it can be observed from angles that were impossible from Earth. Their reflected light becomes stronger. Atmospheric measurements improve. Orbital details become clearer. A world that was once only a small signal in a telescope begins to acquire actual features. That would be an important moment because no matter how carefully the destination had been studied before departure, the ship would have launched with incomplete knowledge. Remote astronomy can reveal a great deal. It can measure planetary size, orbital period, mass in some cases, atmospheric constituents under favorable conditions, and the amount of energy a world receives from its star. But a planet is more complicated than a list of measurements. Clouds change, atmospheres circulate, surfaces may contain oceans, ice, deserts, volcanic regions, or chemistry that distant instruments only partly reveal. If life exists there, even in microbial form, the scientific and ethical situation becomes far more complex. As the ship approaches, the people aboard would finally begin replacing inference with direct observation, and they might discover that the world is not quite what their ancestors expected. Perhaps the atmosphere is thinner. Perhaps the surface temperature varies more strongly than early models suggested. Perhaps the planet has less accessible water. Perhaps the atmosphere is chemically suitable for protected habitats, but not for unfiltered breathing. Or perhaps the target turns out to be better than expected in ways no distant telescope could resolve. The arrival generation would have to work with reality rather than promise. That generation would be different from the ones before it. For centuries, the mission could always point forward. Later, someday. For those approaching the destination, someday becomes a date. Children might grow up knowing they will probably live to see another star fill their sky. Training would change. The ship would need more planetary science, surface construction, geology, atmospheric chemistry, resource extraction, and field medicine. Skills developed for maintaining a closed habitat would still matter, but new environments would have to be understood. Robotic probes could move ahead of the human landing. They could survey potential sites, examine soil and rock, search for hazardous chemistry, map water resources, and study any signs of native biology before people are exposed to them. If local life exists, contamination becomes a concern in both directions. Earth organisms could alter an alien environment before scientists understand it. An unfamiliar biosphere could also contain chemistry or biological structures that human medicine has never encountered. There is no need to imagine hostility. Difference alone would justify caution. The people aboard would know how to be cautious. Their entire civilization would have been built around managing a limited environment with little margin for careless mistakes. Yet arrival would ask them to do something their culture had rarely done: open the system. For generations, safety meant keeping the habitat sealed, controlling air, controlling water, controlling microbes, maintaining boundaries. Now the destination would be outside those boundaries, a real landscape, uncontrolled weather, uncontrolled geology, a horizon that does not curve back toward the ceiling. For someone born aboard the ship, stepping on a planet might feel less like returning to nature and more like entering an environment no human body in their family had ever experienced. Even gravity could feel unfamiliar. The ship's artificial gravity would have been designed and maintained within a known range. The destination planet might pull more strongly or more weakly. People might need time to adapt, even if the difference were modest. The sky would be stranger still. There would be an actual atmosphere overhead. Light scattered through gases rather than produced by ceiling panels. Clouds, if the planet has them, would move without being scheduled. Sunrise would happen because a world was rotating beneath a star. Wind could arrive without a fan. For the first settlers, these ordinary planetary experiences might be some of the least ordinary sensations agents of their lives. And there is a quiet reversal in that the ancestors who left Earth built a ship because they needed a world that could travel. Their descendants would arrive, carrying a culture shaped entirely by that artificial world. The destination would not simply become home. because it was a planet. Home had already happened. It was behind them, in the rotating habitat that raised their families and preserved their history across the dark between stars. The task at arrival would not be to abandon the ship and begin again. It would be to carry what the ship had become into a new place. Its knowledge, its habits of maintenance, its language, its arguments, its memories, its ways of teaching children that survival depends on understanding the systems around them. For centuries, the vessel had been designed to deliver people to another world. By the time it arrived, it would also be delivering a world of its own. By the time the destination fills the forward instruments, almost everything about the voyage will have changed except one thing. The ship will still have to keep people alive tomorrow. Arrival does not switch that responsibility off. The reactors continue running, water continues circulating, crops continue growing. Children still wake beneath scheduled morning light. Maintenance teams still inspect pumps and seals. Someone still checks the chemistry of the air. The vessel cannot become unnecessary. Simply because a planet is near for a long while, it may remain the safest place the community has. Robotic explorers would probably reach the surface first. They could map terrain, identify stable ground, measure radiation, examine atmospheric chemistry, search for accessible water, and study whatever biology may exist without exposing thousands of people to an environment that is still partly unknown. Habitats might be built before permanent settlement begins. Power systems could be placed, landing areas prepared, water processing equipment tested, samples returned to protected laboratories aboard the ship. The process could take years. After centuries of travel, there would be little reason to hurry through the final few, and perhaps that would surprise the people who once imagined interstellar arrival as a single dramatic moment. A door opens. A foot touches another world. History changes. Real settlement would probably be quieter than that. A sequence of measurements, a sequence of cautious decisions. The first small structures on the surface. The first equipment that survives a full local season. First plants grown under the new gravity. The first night when a group of people sleeps on the planet while the ship remains visible above them. Then another group follows, and another. The population would not move all at once. Some people might remain aboard for years. Some might choose never matters. After many generations, the ship would not merely be transportation. It would contain homes, graves or memorials, schools, neighborhoods, traditions, and places carrying layers of personal history. A corridor could be ordinary to an outsider and deeply important to the family that had lived beside it for 6 generations. A garden might contain trees descended from plants brought from Earth. A public room might have hosted weddings, elections, arguments, lessons, and funerals for centuries. To abandon all of that simply because a new landscape exists below would not necessarily feel natural. The vessel might become the first city of the new system. It could remain in orbit as an industrial center, archive, research station, or permanent home for people who prefer the environment their civilization already knows. Others would build lives on the surface. Children born during this period might grow up moving between 2 definitions of home, one enclosed, one open. They might visit grandparents who still live inside the rotating habitat and then return to a settlement beneath a real atmosphere. For the first time in the history of the voyage, the community would have an elsewhere, another place to go, another source of materials, another horizon. The closed world would begin to open, and with that opening, some of the habits that kept the ship alive for centuries might gradually lose their urgency. Water on the planet might be abundant. Construction material could come from local rock instead of endlessly recycled structures. Energy might be generated with resources that were never part of the original vessel. Living space could expand. beyond the careful limits of the habitat. Population planning could change. A civilization shaped by scarcity would encounter room. That transitions might be more difficult than it sounds. People raised inside strict material accounting would carry those instincts with them. A culture that learned to repair before replacing, recycle before discarding, and measure every resource carefully would not forget those habits overnight. Perhaps it should not. The new world would also have limits. Different limits, but limits all the same. And the people arriving would possess something valuable. Precisely because of the journey they had endured, they would understand that survival is not created by having unlimited resources. It is created by understanding the systems that connect them. The first settlement would inherit that knowledge. So would its schools. Children might learn the history of the voyage, alongside the geology of the planet beneath their feet. They would study why their ancestors built rotating habitats and closed water loops, even if they themselves had never needed either. The ship would slowly become history, not immediately, maybe not for many generations, but eventually a child could be born on the planet who has never visited it. They might see the old vessel crossing the sky as a moving point of light. Teachers would explain that people once lived inside it for centuries, that generations were born there, that the community crossed the distance between stars without any living person aboard knowing the whole journey from beginning to end. To that child, the ship might seem almost impossible, in the same way that distant parts of human history can seem impossible. Now, people crossed oceans without engines, built observatories without computers, learned the motion of the sky before telescopes, maintained stories across centuries when memory had to travel through human voices. The interstellar vessel would become another part of that long record, a reminder that some human projects are larger than one lifetime. And perhaps this is what the generation ship idea reveals most clearly. Interstellar travel is often imagined as a problem of speed. Build a stronger engine, find a better fuel, cross the distance faster. Speed matters. But once the journey becomes longer than a human life, another problem appears. Continuity. Can knowledge survive? Can machinery remain understandable? Can a population stay healthy? Can a society change without losing the ability to maintain the steam systems supporting it? Can people born into a mission they never chose make that mission their own? Can one generation build carefully enough for another generation it will never meet? Those questions are not separate from the spacecraft. They are the spacecraft. The pressure hull and engines are only part of the structure. The rest is carried in classrooms, workshops, families, archives, gardens, laws, habits, and the ordinary decision to repair something before it fails. A generation ship would have to preserve more than life. It would have to preserve the capacity to continue. That is a much larger task, and it is why such a vessel would eventually stop being understood as a machine traveling toward a world. For the people inside, it would already be one, a world with boundaries you can point to, a world whose weather is engineered, whose rivers are pipes, whose sunrise comes from lamps, samous, whose gravity comes from motion, whose oldest landscapes were designed by people remembered only in archives, and whose future depends on children learning enough about that world to inherit it, without being trapped by the intentions of those who built it. Perhaps, centuries after departure, someone would stand near the outer hull and look through an observation window toward the destination star. They would know the names of oceans on Earth. They would know the color of its sky. They might know recordings of birds they had never heard in open air. None of that would make their own life less complete. Behind them would be their family, their language, their work, the gardens where they grew up, the familiar curve of the corridor, the almost unnoticed weight of the rotating floor beneath their feet. and ahead would be a planet. Their ancestors had crossed the dark to reach, not an escape from home, the beginning of another one. The old ship keeps turning beneath the new star,